The first thing I saw when I pulled off that cracked road was a woman standing on my porch like she belonged there. My hands locked on the steering wheel. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I hadn't told anyone but Patricia I was coming out here. And Patricia was 40 miles back in the city, none the wiser to what I was about to walk into. My name is Roberta Augustine. I'm 66 years old, a widow now, and up until that morning, I thought the worst thing waiting for me at that old beach house was dust and termites. I'd called Patricia before I left that morning, told her exactly where I was headed and why. That boy of mine wants me to sell the house your husband and I built our whole life around, I said, and I won't sign one paper until I see it with my own eyes first. She told me to call her the second I got there. I told her I would. I didn't know yet that I'd have a reason to forget. The drive down felt longer than I remembered. 23 years will do that to a road, make it strange even when every turn is the same. By the time I reached the property, the sun was already leaning low, throwing long shadows across the weeds that had swallowed the front yard whole. The gate hadn't been touched since Lionel passed. Rust had eaten into the hinges, and when I gripped it with both hands and pushed, it screamed like it didn't want to let me through. I want to say a quick word here. If you're watching this, drop where you're tuning in from tonight. I read every single one of those comments, and tonight, more than most nights, I think I'm going to need the company. I got the gate open enough to slip through, brushing rust flakes off my palms. And that's when I looked up. She was standing on the porch. Not a stranger. Not some drifter who'd broken in looking for shelter. A woman I knew the shape of before I even saw her face clearly. The way she held her shoulders, the way she stood with her weight tilted onto one hip, like she was bracing for something. My knees went soft beneath me. The air went thin. I didn't move. I couldn't have told you in that moment whether my heart was still beating or had simply stopped to take in what my eyes refused to accept. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She just stood there, staring back at me with the same disbelief I imagine was written all over my own face, like we were both waiting for the other one to dissolve into the evening light and prove we'd imagined it. I thought about Lionel. I thought about every single time he drove down here alone, 4 times a year, never staying more than 2 days, never once asking me to come with him no matter how many times I offered. I thought about all the nights I sat in our house in the city, never once suspecting that the silence I felt from him after every trip wasn't grief over an empty beach house. It was something else, something he carried alone. My foot finally moved, one step, then another. The gate creaked shut behind me on its own, like it had decided I belonged on this side of it now. The woman's lips parted. Her hand came up slightly, like she meant to reach for me, then stopped halfway, like she didn't trust that I was real either. And then I heard her voice, thin, cracked, barely above the wind moving through the grass. "Roberta?" She said my name like she'd seen a ghost, too. Eveline's hand dropped back to her side like she'd caught herself doing something forbidden. Before I could take another step towards her, she was already shaking her head, backing toward the door behind her. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "You need to go, Roberta. Right now, before..." "Before what?" My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. 23 years of grieving her, of standing over an empty grave marker my own mother insisted on placing, even without a body, to put beneath it. And she wanted to talk to me about leaving. She glanced past me, toward the road, toward the gate I'd just forced open. Her whole body had gone tight, like a woman listening for a sound she prayed wouldn't come. "I mean it," she said. "Oh, please, just turn around and..." "I buried you." The words cracked out of me before I could soften them. I stood in the rain at a funeral with no casket because there was nothing to put in one. I have spent 23 years thinking my sister drowned, and you are standing on a porch telling me to leave? Her jaw tightened. For a moment, she looked like she might actually do it. Turn, walk back inside, lock the door, and let me stand out there shouting at wood and glass. But she didn't. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself like the evening had gotten colder than it really was. "It's not safe for you to be asking questions out here," she said, quieter now. "Safe from what?" I took a step closer. "Eveline, look at me. I am not getting back in that car until you tell me what is going on." She let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. Her eyes moved over my face slowly, like she was trying to find the version of me she remembered inside the woman standing in front of her now. Older, harder, less patient than the sister she'd left behind. "You don't understand what you're walking into," she said. "Then explain it to me." "I can't." "You can't, or you won't." Something in her expression flickered, not anger, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for so long, your arms forget how to put it down, even when you want to. She turned partway from me, one hand pressed against the porch post, like she needed it to hold herself up. "There are things I promised never to say out loud," she said. "Not to anyone, not even to you." "Promised who?" She didn't answer that. Instead, her shoulders dropped, like whatever wall she'd been holding up against me had finally given out from the weight of it. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, smaller and far more frightened than I'd ever heard my sister sound, even as a girl. "You think I wanted to let you believe I was gone?" she said. "You think that didn't break something in me every single day?" I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "Lionel knew," she said. "He's known the whole time." The name hung in the air between us longer than any silence should be allowed to last. I felt my legs carry me to the porch steps without deciding to move, and I sat down hard on the second one because standing suddenly felt like more than my body could manage. "He knew," I said, more to myself than to her. "All those trips, 4 times a year, never more than 2 days." I looked up at her. "He was coming to see you." Eveline lowered herself onto the step beside me. Slow, like her joints had aged faster out here than they should have. Up close, I could see the years on her in ways the porch light had hidden. Fine lines around eyes that used to laugh easier, a thinness in her face that spoke of meals skipped more often than not. "He brought me what he could," she said. "Money, when he had it. News about you, about the boys. He never told me anything that could put you in danger if I ever slipped and said it out loud to the wrong person." I stared at her. "He never told me." "No," she said quietly. "I begged him not to. More than once." I looked at her in disbelief. "He said keeping something like this from you was the hardest thing he'd ever done," she continued. "But every time he came here, he said the same thing. If Roberta knows, she carries it alone. If Marvy never realizes she knows, he'll watch every look on her face, every word she says. If she truly doesn't know, she can't accidentally betray you because there's nothing to betray. He hated it, Roberta. But he believed ignorance was the only protection he could still give you." "Danger from who?" I asked. "Eveline, just tell me." She shook her head, fast, like the question itself frightened her. "I can't say his name yet." "Why not?" "Because I had to disappear, Roberta. I didn't choose this life out here alone. Somebody made sure I had no choice." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together like she was trying to physically hold the rest of it inside her chest. I reached for her hand without thinking, and she let me take it, though her fingers trembled in mine. "You're safe to tell me now," I said. "He can't hurt you through me?" That's exactly how he'd hurt me. She turned to face me fully, eyes wet but steady. If I say his name out here, today, with no plan, no protection, it doesn't stay quiet. People talk. Word travels faster than you'd believe, even from a place like this. And if it reaches him before I'm ready, he won't come for me first. What does that mean? She squeezed my hand once, hard, like she was trying to transfer the weight of her fear into my palm so I'd understand it the way she did. It means he'll go after what matters to him losing, she said. And right now, that's whoever's still standing close enough for him to reach. I thought of Isaiah. I thought of every phone call he'd made about that house, every time he'd mentioned Marvine's name like it was nothing, like it was just family helping family. Eveline, I need time, she said, cutting me off before I could push further. Just a little. To think about how to do this right so that when I do say it, it's not just words floating out into nothing. It has to mean something. It has to protect you and not just unburden me. I wanted to argue. I wanted to shake the truth loose from her right there on those steps. But something in the way she gripped my hand, desperate, pleading, 23 years overdue, told me that if I pushed too hard tonight, I might lose her all over again. Okay, I whispered. Time. She let out a breath like she'd been holding it since the moment she first saw me at that gate. If I say his name, she said quietly, it brings him here. I need time. I left Eveline that night with a promise to come back in 2 days, and a silence between us so heavy I could still feel it pressing on my chest hours later, sitting in my own kitchen back in the city. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the drive home turning her words over and over, trying to find a shape that made sense of them, and finding nothing but more questions. By morning, I'd made up my mind about one thing, at least. If Lionel had left papers, records, anything that could tell me who Eveline was hiding from, the will was the place to start. I called the attorney who'd handled Lionel's estate, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Whitlow, who'd known my husband for better than 15 years. He answered on the second ring, surprised to hear from me so soon after the holidays had passed, without any contact between us. Mrs. Augustine, he said. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until the spring filings. Is everything all right? I want to understand exactly what Lionel left me, I said. Specifically the beach house. I need to know whose name is actually on it. There was a pause, papers shuffling on his end. That property is yours outright, Mrs. Augustine. Lionel made sure of that years before he passed. Sole ownership, no liens, no other names attached. Relief moved through me, quick and clean, followed almost immediately by something heavier settling in behind it. Then why? I asked slowly. Would Isaiah be telling me Marvine's already handling paperwork on it? Another pause, longer this time. Marvine's been involved in the family's financial matters for a long while now, Mr. Whitlow said carefully, like a man choosing his footing on uneven ground. Going back over 20 years, if I recall. He helped establish the original family trust structure and, from the beginning, handled its day-to-day administration. My role was the estate planning and probate side whenever Lionel needed legal work done. Lionel always said Marvine had a head for numbers none of the rest of you cared to bother with. He set up the trust, I repeated. That's right. Your husband trusted him completely with it. Frankly, so did most of the family. Marvine's the one everyone called when there was a question about the trust or family finances. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over slowly, feeling the unease settle into my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. 20 years of trust, handed to one man with no one else ever asking to look closer. Mr. Whitlow, I said carefully, has Marvine contacted you recently? About the beach house specifically? The pause this time felt different, heavier. Actually, yes, he said. A few weeks back. He requested copies of the property records. Said he was gathering paperwork on Isaiah's behalf, getting things in order in case a sale moved forward. My hand tightened around the phone. On Isaiah's behalf, I said. That's what he told my office. Yes. I assumed you were aware. I wasn't aware of any of it. Not the request. Not the timeline. Not how long Marvine had already been quietly setting things in motion behind a closed door I hadn't even known existed. Thank you, Mr. Whitlow, I managed. I'll be in touch. I hung up the phone and stood there in my kitchen a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling the floor shift slightly beneath a marriage and a family I thought I understood completely. 2 days later, I drove back out to the beach house, Mr. Whitlow's words still circling in my mind, the whole way down that same long road. Eveline was waiting on the porch this time, like she'd been watching for my car since morning. We sat inside in the small front room I barely recognized from the home I remembered, and I told her everything Mr. Whitlow had said. Her face changed when I got to Marvin's name. Not surprise, exactly, but something tighter, more guarded, like an old wound being pressed without warning. He's always had his hands on the money, she said quietly. Longer than you know. I was about to ask her what that meant when I noticed her eyes drop, just briefly, to a spot near the closet at the edge of the room. A single floorboard, slightly raised, slightly darker than the ones around it, like it had been lifted and replaced more than once over the years. What's under there? I asked. Eveline went still. Nothing you need tonight. Eveline. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, crossed the room slowly and knelt by that board, like it cost her something just to be near it. Her fingers hovered over the edge for a long moment before she finally pried it up. I found this years ago, she said, lifting out a small metal lockbox, dust thick along its corners. Lionel left it here on one of his visits. Told me to keep it safe, just in case. In case of what? He never said directly. She looked down at the box. Only that he didn't know who he could safely trust anymore, and if anything ever happened to him, this was the one place he believed nobody would think to search. Everyone thought this house had been abandoned years ago. She paused. He made me promise not to move it unless there was no other choice. And you never opened it? She shook her head. I told myself it was because I didn't have a key. But the truth is, I was scared of what might be inside. Scared of what it would make me do once I knew. I understood that fear better than I wanted to admit. Some truths feel safer left sealed, because once you see them, there's no more pretending you don't know what they cost. We don't have to open it tonight, I said, though my hands were already reaching for it. Yes, we do. Eveline's voice was steadier than I expected. I've carried this long enough alone. She found a thin letter opener in a drawer nearby and worked it gently beneath the lock until it gave with a small, tired click. Inside were folded papers, yellowed at the edges, smelling faintly of salt air and time. Old bank statements. A ledger, handwritten in Lionel's careful slanted script. Numbers and dates running down the page in neat, deliberate columns. I lifted the ledger out with both hands, scanning line after line of transfers I didn't understand. Accounts I'd never heard of. Dates stretching back further than I expected. Eveline leaned closer beside me, her breath catching as my finger stopped on one entry near the bottom of the page. A transfer, a signature beside it, small but unmistakable. Marvine. Eveline's hand came up to cover her mouth. Neither of us spoke. The only sound in that room was the soft creak of the floorboard settling back into place beside us, like the house itself had just exhaled a secret it had been holding far too long. I set the ledger down on the floor between us, but my eyes stayed fixed on that signature, like staring at it long enough might change what it said. "You knew about this," I said. "This whole time." Eveline didn't answer right away, and something about her silence pulled at me differently than it had the night before. This wasn't fear holding her back now. It was hesitation, calculation, maybe, and that bothered me more than I expected. "Eveline, you let me believe you drowned. You let me grieve you for 23 years, and you're sitting here deciding how much of this you're ready to give me?" Her head came up sharp. "You think this is easy for me? Watching you find pieces of it on your own when I should have been the one to tell you?" "Then tell me," I said. "All of it, not pieces." She looked down at the ledger again, jaw tight, before she finally spoke. "I caught him. Years ago, before any of this." She gestured vaguely toward the lockbox. "Marvine was managing the family trust, the one he built himself, the one everyone trusted because nobody else wanted to deal with the numbers. I found discrepancies. Money moved out, dressed up to look like fees, administrative costs, things nobody would think twice to question. How much? Enough that it wasn't a mistake," she said. "Enough that when I asked him about it directly, he didn't even bother pretending it was an accident." "What did he say?" Her hands twisted together in her lap. "He told me I didn't understand how trusts work, that what looked irregular to me was just how things were managed at that level." He smiled the whole time he said it, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "And you didn't believe him?" "Of course I didn't believe him." Her voice cracked, sharp and sudden. "I've never been stupid, Roberta, whatever you might think looking at me out here all these years." That stung more than I expected it to. And I realized how it must have sounded, like I was accusing her of complicity instead of trying to understand the shape of what she'd survived. I softened my voice. "I don't think you're stupid," I said. "I think you're scared. I just need you to stop protecting me from the truth long enough to let me help you." Something in her face shifted at that. The hard edge in her eyes gave way, just slightly, to something rawer underneath it. "It wasn't one conversation," she said quietly. "It wasn't one mistake I caught him in and let go. I confronted him about it more than once, over months, because I kept thinking maybe he'd stop if he knew someone was watching." "And did he?" She gave a slow shake of her head. "The last time I confronted him," she said, "he stopped arguing altogether. He asked me where I'd been that morning, told me I'd stopped by the grocery store before coming to see him, and asked if your boys liked the candy I'd bought them. I'd never told him I'd seen the boys that day. I'd never told him where I'd been." She drew a slow breath. Then he smiled and said, "Family would be devastated if somebody got hurt over a misunderstanding." He never raised his voice. He just wanted me to know he could reach the people I loved whenever he wanted. She looked back down at the ledger, to that signature neither of us could look away from for long. "That wasn't the only time I caught him," she said. "A week passed before I made it back to the city. A week of sitting with Eveline each evening while she told me what little more she could bear to say, and driving home each night to a house that felt emptier than it had since Lionel's funeral. I hadn't told Isaiah anything yet. I didn't trust myself to say it the right way, not until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. So when he called and asked me to dinner at his place, I went, telling myself I'd watch and listen before I said a single word about the beach house, about Eveline, about any of it. Marvine was already there when I arrived, seated at Isaiah's table like he'd been coming to that house for years, which I suppose, in some sense, he had. He stood when I walked in, all warmth and practiced charm, pulling out my chair before I could reach it myself. "Roberta," he said, "you look tired. Everything all right?" "Just a long week," I said, and left it there. Dinner moved the way it always did with Marvine in the room. Easy laughter, stories about Lionel that made Isaiah smile in a way I hadn't seen since the funeral, comfortable silences that never felt like silence at all. Watching him, I found myself studying details I'd never paid attention to before. The way he refilled glasses before anyone asked. The way he steered conversations gently, always landing exactly where he intended them to land. Speaking of which, Marvine said, setting down his fork with practiced ease, I spoke to Whitlow's office again this week, about the beach house. My fork stilled halfway to my plate. I figured I'd help move things along, he continued, glancing at Isaiah, then back at me. No sense in you carrying all that paperwork alone, Roberta, not on top of everything else you're managing right now. I haven't decided to sell, I said carefully. Isaiah's expression flickered, a small frown creasing his brow. Mama, we talked about this. That house is just sitting there, falling apart. Uncle Marvine's just trying to help. I appreciate that, I said, keeping my voice even, though something cold was settling low in my stomach. But it's my decision. Marvine smiled, easy as ever, hands raised slightly like a man surrendering a point he didn't actually intend to give up. Of course it is. I only meant to make things simpler for you. In fact, he paused, almost casually, reaching for his Aranchi glass. I already have someone interested, a buyer, ready to move quickly if you decide to go that route. The table went quiet for a beat too long. A buyer, I repeated, already. These things move faster than people expect, he said, smiling at me over the rim of his glass, like he hadn't just told me something that made no sense at all for a property that had sat untouched, unlisted, and unseen by anyone outside our family for over 2 decades. Who is this buyer? I asked. I'd want a name, at the very least, before I considered anything. I'll have my office send the details, Marvine said smoothly, already turning to refill Isaiah's glass, the question sliding past him like it had never been asked at all. I made a quiet note to myself, right there at that table, to remember he never actually gave me one. I left that dinner with Marvine's voice still circling in my head, that easy mention of a buyer already lined up for a house no one but family even knew still existed. It didn't sit right, and the only way I knew to settle it was to go looking for someone who might remember the bank Lionel's ledger pointed back to. It took me 2 days of phone calls and old contacts to track down a name attached to that branch from decades back. A teller, retired now, living quiet on the edge of town. Constance Pruitt. She answered her door slowly, studying me through the screen before she finally unlatched it, like a woman who'd learned caution the hard way. Augustine, she said, before I'd even given my name. I wondered if somebody from that family would ever come knocking. She let me in, made tea neither of us touched, and sat across from me in a small living room crowded with old photographs and church fans stacked in neat little towers. I worked at that bank for 18 years, she said. Saw a lot of things cross my desk in that time. Most of it was nothing. Some of it wasn't. I found a ledger, I said, with Lionel's handwriting, a name on a transfer that didn't sit right with me. Her eyes sharpened. Marvine Lashley. My breath caught. You remember him? Honey, I remember exactly why I don't work there anymore. She laughed, short and bitter, no humor in it at all. I flagged a transfer back then. Wasn't the first time something about that trust looked off to me, but it was the first time I put it in writing and sent it up the chain. What happened? Nothing happened to him, she said. Everything happened to me. Within a month, I was let go. Restructuring, they called it. Funny how restructuring only ever seemed to find the people asking the wrong questions. I sat forward. Did anyone ever investigate the report? Not that I ever heard. By the time I was gone, it was like it never existed. She paused, studying me carefully now, like she was deciding how much trust to extend a woman she barely knew. "You're not here just to confirm an old man's signature, are you?" "No," I admitted. "I think he's still doing it. I think he never stopped." Constance was quiet a long moment, her hands folding together in her lap. Then she rose, slow and deliberate, and walked to a small cabinet near the window. She pulled out a thin folder, yellowed at the edges, and set it on the table between us without a word. "I kept a copy," she said. "Back then. Company policy said I shouldn't have. But after I was fired, I couldn't shake the feeling that my report was going to disappear along with me. I told myself it was foolish, holding on to something that didn't matter to anybody but me anymore." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it. "Why keep it all these years?" I asked. She looked at me steady, no hesitation at all. "Because deep down," she said, "I always believed the original had been buried. And if that ever happened, somebody would need proof that at least one person tried to stop it. I just didn't know it'd take this long for someone to come asking." I drove straight from Constance's house back to the beach, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like it might combust if I looked at it too long. Eveline was waiting on the porch again, and the moment she saw my face, she knew I'd found something that confirmed every fear she'd been carrying alone. I told her everything Constance had said, watched her absorb each piece with a stillness that frightened me more than tears would have. When I finished, she sat down hard on the porch step, staring out at nothing. "There's more," she said quietly. "You said that wasn't the only time you caught him. You never finished telling me what happened after." She nodded slowly, like she'd known this moment was coming, and had simply been waiting for the strength to meet it. 5 years after I disappeared," she said, "I almost came back. I'd convinced myself enough time had passed that maybe he'd moved on, found new ways to keep the trust quiet without needing me gone." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I called him, just once. Told him I was thinking about coming home." "What did he say?" Her jaw tightened. "He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Marvin. He never needed to. He just got very calm, very quiet, and told me he'd heard you'd taken the boys to visit your mother that same week. Said it would be a shame if something happened to them on the drive, the roads being what they are this time of year." The air left my lungs in one sharp pull. "He threatened my children." "He didn't say it outright," Eveline said. "He never says anything outright. But I understood exactly what he meant. Before I disappeared, he'd already shown me how much he seemed to know about where people were, who they'd seen, things no stranger should have known. Whether he was bluffing or not didn't matter anymore. I wasn't willing to gamble with your boys' lives to find out." She swallowed hard. "I hung up that phone, and I didn't try again for 18 years. Why didn't you ever go to the police, even quietly, from somewhere far from here?" "With what proof, Roberta?" she said. "A respected man's word against a woman everyone already believed was dead. I had no paper trail back then, no ledger, nothing but my own voice against his. If I walked into a station claiming I'd been dead for 5 years, the first questions would have been about me, not him. By the time anyone decided whether to believe my story, he'd have known I was alive. And if they couldn't charge him, I'd have handed him exactly what he wanted most, my location. I couldn't risk your family on the hope that someone might believe me." Rage moved through me, hot and immediate, the kind that made my hands shake where they rested in my lap. 18 years. 18 years of my sister sitting alone in this house because a man smiled at a funeral and shook everyone's hand and called himself family while threatening to hurt my children if she so much as tried to come home. "How did you even manage all this time?" I asked. "Money, food. Lionel's cash got me through what it could," she said. The rest I made myself. A little garden out back. Mending and washing for folks 2 towns over who never ask too many questions about a quiet woman with no last name they recognized. He's a monster, I said, the word feeling too small for what it needed to hold. He's careful, Eveline corrected. That's worse. Monsters get caught eventually. Careful men don't. I looked at her, something cold crawling up my spine. Eveline, does he know you're still here? Right now? Today? She hesitated, long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. I don't think he knows for certain, she said. But I've seen his car pass by out on the main road more than once over the years. Slow, like he was looking for something, never stopping, never coming close enough to the gate to see anything. She turned to look at me, fear flickering back into her eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. But he's looked, she said. More than once. He's always wondered. Isaiah called me 3 days later, and I knew from the tightness in his voice before he even finished his greeting that something had shifted while I wasn't watching. Mama, we need to talk about the house, he said. Seriously, this time. I'm listening. Uncle Marvin says you've been acting strange about it. Driving out there alone, not answering calls for days at a time. He's worried about you. Honestly. So am I. I felt my stomach tighten. Worried how? He thinks the grief is hitting you harder than you're letting on, Isaiah said. Careful, like he was repeating words he'd practiced believing. Says it's not uncommon. Losing a spouse after that many years. For a person to start holding on to things that don't make sense anymore. Fixating on the past instead of moving forward. He said I was fixating. He said you might not be thinking as clearly as you usually do, Isaiah said. And honestly, Mama, the way you've been about that house, refusing to sign anything, disappearing out there without telling anyone where you are, I'm starting to wonder if he's right. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling something cold settle into the space between my son's words and my own racing thoughts. Marvin hadn't raised his voice to threaten me. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply planted a single seed, she's not thinking clearly, and let it grow on its own in the people who trusted him most. Isaiah, I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said. There are things about that house, about your father, that you don't understand yet. Then explain them to me, he said. Because right now, all I see is you falling apart over a property that's falling apart right along with you. Dad's gone, Mama. He's not coming back. No matter how many times you drive out there to sit with whatever's left of him in that house. The words landed harder than he probably meant them to. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath before I answered. This isn't about grief, I said quietly. This is about truth, about things your father carried that I'm only now starting to understand. What truth? What are you even talking about? I can't explain it yet. Not until I'm certain. That's exactly what Uncle Marvin said you'd say. Isaiah's voice rose, frustration breaking through the careful calm he'd been holding since the call started. Mama, listen to yourself. You sound like you're chasing ghosts. I flinched at the word, more than he could have known. Isaiah. I think you need to let Dad rest, he said, voice cracking slightly now. Grief and anger tangled together in a way that broke something in me to hear. I think you need to stop digging up whatever this is and let him rest in peace instead of dragging his memory through some story only you seem to understand. The line went quiet between us, heavy and unresolved, and for the first time since this all began, I felt the full weight of standing alone against a man my own son had already learned to trust more than me. I drove back out to the beach house the next morning, Isaiah's words still raw in my chest, and spread everything across Eveline's small kitchen table, Lionel's ledger, Constance's flagged report, the bank statements yellowed with age. We sat together for hours, comparing dates, matching names, trying to build something solid enough to stand against a man everyone else still trusted completely. "Look at this," Eveline said, sliding the ledger toward me, her finger resting on a column of dates near the back. "These transfers didn't stop after I left. They kept going. Different amounts, same pattern, year after year." "That's 20 years of this," I said, the number landing heavier than I expected, even though I'd already known it in pieces. "20 years nobody questioned," Eveline said, "because nobody else ever needed to look. He made sure of that from the very beginning." I sat back, something clicking into place that I hadn't let myself see clearly until that moment. He set up the trust himself, structured the whole thing. Lionel told me that. The attorney told me that. Everyone always said the same thing about him. He had a head for numbers none of the rest of us wanted to deal with. "So nobody checked," Eveline said quietly. "Why would they? You don't audit the man everyone calls the smart one. You just hand him the keys and thank him for carrying the weight you didn't want to carry yourself." The realization settled into me slow and cold, the way truth sometimes does when it rearranges everything you thought you understood about people you loved. It wasn't carelessness that let this run 2 decades. It was trust, weaponized so quietly that none of us ever noticed the blade. "There's something else," I said, pulling Constance's report closer, scanning the final page again. "Look at this line here, near the bottom. It says the trust was never formally dissolved. Even after most of the assets were supposedly distributed years ago, the structure itself stayed open." Eveline frowned, leaning in. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning he still has access," I said. "Right now. Today. As long as that trust technically exists, he can move money through it, justify withdrawals, keep doing exactly what he's always done. Because on paper, it still looks like an active account he's simply managing." Eveline's face went pale. "And if the house sells—" "If the house sells," I said slowly, the full shape of it finally coming into focus, "he gets the final piece he needs. No property left tied to the original trust. No physical evidence left for anyone to stumble onto by accident, the way I did. He closes it quietly, walks away clean, and nobody ever has reason to look back at any of it again." The kitchen went silent around us, just the soft creak of the house settling, the distant sound of waves somewhere beyond the dunes. "That's why he's pushing so hard," Eveline whispered. "It's not about money for him anymore. It's about erasing the last thing that could ever prove what he did." I looked at the papers spread across that table. 20 years of careful, quiet theft, hidden behind a smile everyone in my family had learned to trust, without question. And felt something inside me shift, from fear into resolve. "Then we don't let him close it," I said. "Not until everyone sees exactly what he's been hiding." Marvin showed up at my door 2 days later, unannounced, holding a small box of pastries like the visit was nothing more than a kind gesture between family. "Thought you could use some company?" he said, smiling that same easy smile he'd worn at every dinner table I'd ever sat across from him. "You've seemed stretched thin lately." Isaiah mentioned he was worried. "That's kind of him," I said, stepping aside to let him in, keeping my voice as steady and ordinary as I could manage. We sat in my living room, pastries untouched on the coffee table between us, and Marvin eased into small talk the way he always did. Easy, comfortable, designed to put a person at rest before he asked whatever it was he'd actually come to ask. "How's the house situation?" he said eventually, stirring sugar into coffee he hadn't really wanted. any closer to a decision. Still thinking it through, I said. Take your time, he said. No rush on my end, of course. I only mentioned the buyer because I didn't want a good opportunity slipping past you. I appreciate that. He studied me a moment longer than the conversation required, his smile staying perfectly in place even as his eyes sharpened slightly. You've been out there a lot, I hear. More than usual, for a house you always said held too many memories to visit comfortably. It's complicated, I said carefully. Lionel's memory feels closer out there. He sipped his coffee, unhurried. Funny thing about that property. Always pictured it sitting empty all these years. Roof, half caved by now. Gate, rusted shut. He paused, just slightly too long. Surprising it's still standing as solid as it is, from what I hear. Something cold moved through me at that, quiet and sharp. I hadn't told him anything about the condition of the house. I hadn't told him it was standing solid at all, let alone given him any reason to hear something about it from anyone. It surprised me too, I said, keeping my voice even, though my pulse had picked up considerably. Marvine smiled again, setting his cup down with deliberate care. Lionel always did build things sturdier than people expected. That man didn't do anything halfway. He didn't, I agreed, watching him now with a different kind of attention, searching for whatever he might let slip next. But he didn't slip again. He simply rose, smoothing his jacket, thanking me for the coffee like the visit had been exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. Let me know about the buyer, he said at the door. Sooner's always better in these situations. I closed the door behind him and stood there a long moment, his words circling back through my mind. Roof half caved by now, still standing as solid as it is, from what I hear. He shouldn't have known anything about that house's condition at all, not unless somebody had told him something or he'd looked closer than he'd ever admitted to anyone in this family. He suspected something. I just didn't yet know how much, or who he suspected it about. I didn't waste time after Marvin's visit. Something in the way he'd slipped about the house told me we were running out of room to be careful, so I found a new attorney, not Whitlow, whose office already had ties to Marvin, but a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Calloway, who specialized in financial fraud cases exactly like this one. I brought her everything: the ledger, Constance's report, photographs of the transfer pages, dates lined up, against each other like a map finally showing its true shape. She read through it slowly, asking precise questions, the kind that made me realize how much weight this case could actually carry once it left my kitchen table and entered a real courtroom. This is substantial, she said finally. But I'll need more than documents. I'll need a witness statement, someone who can speak to intent, to threats, to the full pattern over time. I knew immediately who that meant. Eveline didn't say anything for a long moment when I told her, sitting across from me at the beach house, the ocean wind pressing softly against the windows. 23 years, she said quietly. I've spent 23 years making sure my voice never reached anyone who mattered. I know what I'm asking, I said. I won't pretend it's small. She looked down at her hands, turning them over slowly, like she was studying the woman she'd become out here. Alone, afraid, careful. Then she looked back up at me, something steadier settling into her eyes. I'm tired of being afraid of a man who's never once had to answer for anything, she said. If saying my name out loud is what finally makes him answer, then I'll say it. 2 days later, we sat together in Ms. Calloway's office while Eveline gave her statement, slow and careful at first, her voice gaining strength with every sentence until the fear that had silenced her for over 2 decades finally cracked wide open into something close to relief. She named him. She named the threats. She named every year she'd spent hiding because of words he'd said calmly over a telephone line. When it was done, she sat back, exhausted, but lighter than I'd seen her since the night I first found her on that porch. "It's done," she said. "It's actually done." Ms. Calloway assured us the statement would remain confidential while she prepared the formal complaint and organized the supporting exhibits, limiting access to only the small staff assigned to the file until everything could be filed at once, deliberately designed to give Marvin no warning before the full weight of it reached him. But 2 nights later, my phone rang late, Ms. Calloway's voice tight and urgent on the other end. "Roberta, I need you to stay calm," she said. "We had a serious breach today. One of my paralegals was assigned to organize and scan the exhibits for filing. I discovered she'd photographed part of Eveline's statement with her phone before everything was locked down. It turns out her brother owes Marvin money. He's been forgiving a little at a time for years. She admitted she called him before she understood the consequences." My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "that somehow Marvin Lashley already knows your sister is alive, and he knows she's given a statement against him." Isaiah had already planned a small family dinner that weekend, nothing formal, just a gathering to mark what would have been Lionel's birthday. I almost called to cancel my own attendance, unsure I could sit across that table and hold my composure. Then I decided the opposite. If Marvin already knew what was coming, he wasn't going to face it on his terms. He was going to face it on mine. I brought Ms. Calloway's file with me, the ledger, Constance's report, copies of everything, sealed in a folder I kept close beside me the entire drive over. Marvin arrived before I did, already seated at Isaiah's table when I walked in, his composure intact but tighter than usual, his smile holding a fraction too long when he greeted me. "Roberta," he said, "glad you could make it." "Wouldn't have missed it," I said evenly, taking the seat across from him. Dinner moved slower than usual. Conversation thinner, like everyone at the table could feel something shifting in the air without quite naming it. Marvin kept glancing my way, searching, calculating, his easy charm working overtime to mask whatever panic sat underneath it. When the plates had cleared, I set the folder on the table. "Isaiah," I said, "I need you to look at something. All of you do." "Mama, what is this?" Isaiah frowned, but he reached for the folder anyway. Marvin's hand twitched toward the table, then stilled. "Roberta, whatever this is, surely it can wait until after—" "It's waited 23 years, I said. "It can survive one more dinner." I opened the folder myself, sliding the ledger across to Isaiah, watching his eyes move over Lionel's, handwriting, over the transfers, over the signature at the bottom of page after page. "That's Uncle Marvin's signature," Isaiah said slowly, confusion deepening into something darker as he kept reading. "Your father caught him moving money out of the family trust," I said, "years ago. And so did someone else, who's been alive this entire time, hiding because Marvin threatened to hurt this family if she ever came forward." The table went silent. Marvin's composure finally cracked, just slightly, his jaw tightening as every eye turned toward him. "This is absurd," he said, voice clipped now, the warmth gone entirely. "Roberta, I understand you've been under a great deal of stress, but fabricating something like this—" "It's not fabricated," I said. "Eveline gave a sworn statement 2 days ago. She's alive, Isaiah. She's been alive this whole time." Isaiah's face drained of color. "What?" "Ask him," I said, nodding toward Marvin. "Why he told her, if she ever came home, something might happen to my children on the road." Marvin stood abruptly, chair scraping hard against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to accusations with no merit. You'll be hearing from my attorney about defamation, Roberta. I promise you that." "Then he'll be hearing from mine first," I said calmly. "The complaint's already filed." Isaiah looked between us, the folder trembling slightly in his hands, 20 years of unquestioned trust collapsing in real time across his face. "Uncle Marvin," he said quietly, "is this true?" Marvin didn't answer. He simply turned, grabbed his jacket, and walked out, leaving nothing behind but silence and a son finally seeing clearly who had truly been steering him all along. Marvin didn't disappear the way Eveline once had to. He couldn't. Within a week, Ms. Calloway's complaint moved through the proper channels, and a formal investigation opened into 2 decades of mismanaged trust funds. His name attached to it in records that could no longer be quietly buried or explained away over dinner. It didn't resolve overnight. Ms. Calloway warned me early that financial cases like this take months, sometimes longer, winding through subpoenas and forensic accountants and hearings that test patience more than they satisfy curiosity. Marvin retained an attorney of his own, denied everything publicly, tried for a while to convince what remained of the family that he was the one being wronged. But Isaiah didn't call him again after that night at the dinner table. And when the preliminary findings came back, confirming what Constance's old report had flagged decades earlier, even the relatives who'd once defended Marvin's character started keeping their distance, the way people do once the truth becomes too heavy to keep denying. I drove out to the beach house most weekends after that, the road no longer feeling strange beneath my tires, the gate no longer rusted shut, the way it had been the day I first found my sister standing on that porch. We'd oiled the hinges ourselves, Eveline and I, kneeling together in the dirt one Saturday afternoon, laughing for the first time, in longer than either of us could remember. "Isaiah wants to know if we're really keeping it," Eveline said one evening, the two of us sitting on the steps the way we had that very first night, though everything about the silence between us felt different now. Lighter. "We're keeping it," I said. "It's not for sale. It was never really for sale." She smiled, leaning her shoulder gently against mine. Lionel would have liked that, knowing it ended up holding us together instead of falling apart. "He spent years coming back here just to keep you safe," I said. 4 times a year, never more than 2 days, never once telling me why. I used to think that silence meant something was missing between us. I shook my head slowly. Turns out it meant he was protecting both of us, the only way he knew how. We sat there a long while, watching the sun drop low over water that had outlasted every secret either of us had ever tried to bury. The investigation would run its course in its own time. Marvin would answer for what he'd done, eventually, in rooms far less forgiving than a quiet beach porch at sunset. But that house had already given us back something no courtroom verdict ever could. It had given me my sister. It had given Eveline her voice. It had given us both a kind of peace neither of us had thought possible the day I first forced that rusted gate open and found her standing there, frozen, like she'd seen a ghost, too. I sat with that thought a long moment, watching the waves roll steady against the shore. The house had never been useless. It had been guarding the truth the whole time.